For India, I think the treaty is no longer sacrosanct. It is now seen as a part of a larger rethinking of relations with Pakistan. And for Pakistan, meanwhile, the treaty still remains very vital for survival. It's very existential. And so water brings in a theater of politics. You play water through its emotions. You create uh, sort of images of water that really moves audiences. It's not just about hydrology. It is about.
Greetings, listeners, and welcome to our sixth episode of Understanding Asian Hydropolitics through 5 questions presented by Asian Confluence. And I'm your host, Neeraj. And I'm thrilled to explore a topic that lies at the heart of South Asian geopolitical and environmental challenges. So, today we are diving into the current situation with the Indus Water Treaty and its future, and the insights from a newly published book, Trial by Water, published by Dr. Uttam Kumar Sinha. So, as always, we'll unpack this through 5 engaging questions designed to spark insight and foster meaningful dialogue. So today, we are very lucky and very honored to join today by Dr. Uttam Kumar Sinha, who is a senior fellow at Manohar Parrikar Institute of Defense Studies and Analysis, where he heads the Non-Traditional Security Center and serves as the managing editor of Strategic Analysis. Dr. Sinha is one of India's leading commentators on transboundary water issues and the author of the recently published book Trial by Water, Indus Basin, India-Pakistan Relation, and published by Penguin Random House 2025. As well as he has also published his previous book on Indus Basin Uninterrupted, A History of Territory and Politics from Alexander to Nehru. His extensive work includes fellowships at the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, Harvard Kennedy School, and the Peace Research Institute, Oslo. And he also brings a wealth of expertise to water diplomacy and strategic affairs. So, Dr. Sinha, it's a really honor to have you with us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure, Neeraj.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Sinha. So, just to start this conversation, and for our listeners who may not be deeply familiar, so could you please, briefly outline the significance of the Indus Water Treaty and how it has managed to survive through decades of India-Pakistan relations?
Well, thank you for having me on the show, Neeraj. To begin with, let me say that the Indus Waters Treaty is one of the most remarkable water apportioning agreements in the world. I'm not using the word water sharing because I don't think it was water sharing. It was the division of the Indus Basin into 3 rivers each, the eastern rivers and the western rivers. Therefore, I think it is a water apportioning agreement. It was signed in 1960. It divided the 6 rivers of the Indus system between India and Pakistan. The 3 eastern rivers, Ravi, Beas, Satluj, were allocated to India. The 3 western rivers, Indus, Jhelum, Chenab, were given to Pakistan. So, in simple terms, it created a partition of rivers to match the political partition of land that happened in 1947. What makes the treaty truly extraordinary, I think, is its endurance. And I'm saying this keeping in mind that the treaty no longer endures because things have dramatically changed after Pahalgam. So there is a certain uh, past attached to the Indus Waters Treaty. It survived the wars, as you know, 1965, 1971. It survived the Kargil conflict in 1999. It survived the repeated diplomatic breakdowns that continuously happened between India and Pakistan. While trade, travel, and dialogue have stopped at different times, water cooperation was never suspended till the Pahalgam incident. So, at its heart lies a very powerful idea. The very idea of eventually having a treaty with Pakistan was that water should not be held hostage to politics. And therefore, both nations went in for 8 years of prolonged negotiation before they eventually signed the treaty. And the idea was that to share the water or to share the divided water, you required certain rules, right? And if you didn't share water, then rivers would become weapons of instability. So I think that whole thrust was essentially, it was a very pragmatic and practical thrust towards having a certain mechanism that could allow first the division of the Indus basin and then the sharing of its waters. One of an important aspect, I think, of the treaty was that it created institutions to keep the conversation alive. And the Permanent Indus Commission, precisely, was formed because you would need dialogues between India and Pakistan. They were made up of engineers and officials from both sides, and they met regularly to exchange data and to address various differences. Right. So even in the depths of hostility, this mechanism has worked. Of course, it does not work now because the treaty is in abeyance. One must also understand that the treaty is technical. It's negotiated by engineers. There were no diplomats involved in the negotiation. So the treaty is engineering oriented. It is quite precise, and it searches for engineering solutions. And I think this format, the involvement of the engineers, has given the treaty its resilience against political storms. I think. So while India and Pakistan continue to disagree on many fronts, the Indus Water Treaty probably stands out as an example of cooperation in midst of conflict. It, in a certain sense, also showed how necessity, pragmatism, and the recognition of shared vulnerability can create a framework that endures. So in that sense, it is not just a water treaty; it is a peace treaty in disguise. I'll rather describe it in such a manner. And also another striking part of this treaty, and if I can take a few more minutes to delve in this question, the treaty we say has survived wars, crisis, political mistress. Um but it did not survive on its own. It survived because India allowed it to survive. From the very beginning, India viewed the treaty as an act of generosity. After all, under the geography, the upper riparian state India had a stronger claim. Yet, I think India agreed to let a large portion of the Indus water flow to Pakistan. Why did India do this? First, because I think water is a lifeline, and India recognized that without some arrangement, Pakistan's survival would be at stake. Second, I think India believed that keeping the treaty intact served its own interest by removing water as a trigger for war. And the third element, to my mind, is that New Delhi saw the treaty as relatively insignificant in the larger metrics of its power. India never needed to weaponize water. India had placed itself in world politics through certain approaches and did not ever view to use water as a weapon or as a leverage then. So I think these were and these are, I think, some very um nuanced understanding of the Indus Waters Treaty, and one need to really reflect on it because there are a lot of misperception and misreading about what this treaty is all about.
So that's a really a great foundation, and it remarkable how the treaty has endured despite such fraught relations. So now let us now try to look where things stand today, and according to you and to your assessment also. So what are the key stress points in the Indus Water Treaty today? And how the recent geopolitical development, especially in India-Pakistan relation, affected this kind of implementation in this treaty?
So thank you for that question. I think the past is not what it is, and the current situation has put the treaty into a completely new light. The Indus Treaty, or the Indus Waters Treaty, has always lived in the shadow of India Pakistan tensions. But probably today, it faces perhaps its most serious test. And, in January 2023, a couple of years ago, India issued a notice to Pakistan seeking a modification of the treaty, which is very much part of the treaty's articles. So this effectively placed the treaty in abeyance, signaling that New Delhi was no longer willing to carry the weight of unilateral responsibility. The immediate trigger was Pakistan's repeated resort to international arbitration, and most recently over India's Kisinganga and Ratle hydro project. So, despite India's objection, the World Bank appointed the Court of Arbitration in The Hague. And this is something which was completely out of the text, and something that India realized that it needed to take a certain decision on its own. So these were some of the stress points that emerged that triggered off several other issues, and I think there were three significant interlinked issues that came about. First was that Pakistan's persistent suspicion that India might use water as a weapon, even though India has never done so. So it was a rhetoric at a certain level. Second, India's growing impatience with Pakistan's very obstructionist tactics, which every Indian project were being dragged into the court of arbitration. And third, there was this absence of trust and dialogues in the in the wider bilateral relationship, which leaves no political cushion for the treaty to rest on. So all these events, all these stresses together meant that the Indus Water Treaty was going through several shocks, right? While it withstood the shocks in the past, um, in the current situation, it is now what is technically and officially described as being in abeyance. I think that's important to note. Also, there's been a lot of geopolitical shifts which we must take note of, and these have also sharpened the tensions between India and Pakistan. For India, I think the treaty is no longer sacrosanct. It is now seen as part of a larger rethinking of relations with Pakistan. And for Pakistan, meanwhile, the treaty still remains very vital for survival. It's very existential. And so this asymmetry makes the future very uncertain when it comes to the Indus Water Treaty. So the stress points today are not just technical, Neeraj. They are fundamentally political. The Indus Water Treaty, as we know, has endured for over 6 decades. But its resilience will now depend less on engineering clauses and more on whether the two countries can still find a minimum basis for cooperation. And we have to see this. And to this, you can add another dimension, which again is very challenging, and that is the climate change. It sort of adds a new layer of pressure to the whole basin. The basin is one of the most climate vulnerable in the world. Glaciers are retreating, rainfall is becoming more erratic, and floods and droughts are intensifying. So, for both India and Pakistan, this means less predictability in river flows, more extreme events, and higher demands on already stretched water systems. So, in other words, the treaty, designed in the relatively stable hydrology of, of the 1950s and the 1960s, is now being tested by the uncertainties of the 21st century. So, the geopolitical shifts have sharpened these tensions. And added to this, of course, is the climate change dimension.
So, that really highlights the tension which are pulling at this treaty seems. And geopolitics clearly has a very, huge role to play. So now, but coming back to my next question, because it's very important and you have written a book also. Your book, Trial by Water, provides a very deep dive into the water politics and diplomacy. So, could you share what inspired you to write it and how it connects to the current debates around the Indus Water Treaty? And specifically, I want to know, and the audience also would be very much interested, how this book is differ from your previous book, Indus Water Uninterrupted.
Thank you, Neeraj. Yes, the trial by water, Indus Basin and India-Pakistan relations, published by Penguin Random House, has just hit the stands, and people are talking about it. I get various inputs from it, so it's happy to have written this book. The book actually situates the relationship at the crossroads of history, the crossroads of politics and water diplomacy. And it actually builds directly from the earlier work, Indus Basin Uninterrupted, A History of Territory and Politics from Alexander to Nehru, which, as you know, Neeraj, and you've discussed this book with me, it traced the deep historical evolution of the Indus Basin, right from the Indus Valley civilization to Alexander's campaign to Mughal expansion, to the colonial canal network, and of course, then to the partition and then the signing of the Indus Water Treaty in 1960. So, if my earlier book, The Indus Basin Uninterrupted, was the longue durée sweeping across millennia, Trial by Water focuses on the last 65 years. It examines the treaty Prime Minister Nehru signed with Pakistan President Ayub Khan and how the treaty has survived through wars, through terror, through shifting geopolitics, and why it is now at its most precarious moment under Prime Minister Narendra Modi. And in doing so, the book provides not only a continuation, but also a sharp pivot, from the historical foundations to the charged realities of India-Pakistan relations. And as one reads the book, and I hope people do, we find that the treaty is a treaty of paradoxes. The treaty, as we know, has been celebrated as an unlikely success story. I mean, imagine two countries, India and Pakistan, always at each other's throat, eventually signing a treaty. And I think it's a rare instance of cooperation between the two countries. It was brokered by the World Bank in 1960, and that's also a very interesting element how a third party actor gets involved. And of course, as I said, the engineering influence is very important, also very rare, and how from volumetric assessment, how eventually the negotiation moves into the direction of dividing the basin into eastern rivers and western rivers. So the treaty, as it expresses, it promises certainty and peace, but the paradox here is, did certainty and peace come about after the treaty? And we've seen that there's been wars, there's been cross border issues, there's been state sponsored terror from Pakistan. So the whole promise that it was based on, promise of certainty and peace, eventually did not come about. And therefore, we are in this precarious situation. But I think also the book looks at the treaty as as something very pragmatic also during the time. Uh, while it is paradoxical, but it is also very pragmatic. And this is very important, the pragmatism of how the engineers looked at the Indus Basin. Because we all say today that, India gave away too much water to Pakistan, and probably that was not the best way to approach the negotiation. But you must remember that the Indian engineers focused on controlling the eastern rivers, that is Satluj, Beas, and Ravi. And remember, Pakistan also wanted the eastern rivers because these rivers, the water of these rivers, were very crucial for the canal network that Pakistan had. And Punjab was the breadbasket, the agrarian base. So, eastern rivers were important for both India and Pakistan, right? But India did not concede. India retained exclusive rights on the western rivers. And in return, India had to give the exclusive rights of the western rivers to Pakistan. So when we look at this give and take today, we say by volume, Pakistan seemed the clear winner because the western river delivers an annual flow of roughly 136 million acre feet, whereas the eastern rivers has only 32.6 million acre feet. So when we look at these two figures, the common understanding would be that India has given away more water to Pakistan. Uh, but remember, for India, quantity was not everything. The eastern rivers were the lifelines. They were critical for India irrigating 15 million hectares of land in Punjab. It could power the mighty Bhakra Nangal Dam, which India was building. It could feed the Rajasthan Canal, which India had planned. So, for the Indian engineers, negotiating the treaty meant that they retained complete right on the Eastern River. And to lose the Eastern River to them was simply unthinkable. So, and therefore, at the end of the day, India had to give something in return because no international treaty gives one side everything at once. And the Indus Water Treaty was no exception. So, in return of the eastern rivers, India agreed to pay Pakistan 62 million pounds sterling, which means about 175 US million dollars, right? So, and that money was given to Pakistan to build replacement canals and reservoirs on its side of the border. And India had actually estimated about 80 million. They eventually gave away 175 million. So, more than double its initial estimate. So, I would say that Pakistan, in short, bargained very hard when they lost the eastern rivers. Right? But I would say yet again that even on the western rivers, which Pakistan had exclusive right to, India secured what it valued most, and that is, it got storage capacities on the western rivers, 3.6 million acre feet of storage capacity. It also got a lot of irrigation users of the western rivers. So I think in both eastern rivers and western rivers, India did manage to retain its interest. Having retained its interest, India had to pay for it. So at the end of the day, I would regard this treaty as a triumph of certain principle, triumph of certain interest, and it was a political necessity. It had to come about. Right. I would also think, and I have written this in my book, that water brings in a theater of politics. You play water through its emotions. You create uh, sort of images of water that really moves audiences. It's not just about hydrology; it is about theatrics. It's about rhetoric. Of course, it's about politics, war, but it's also largely to do with nationalism and greatly to do with identity. So, water links to all this in India-Pakistan political relationship. And this is something that I bring out, that water is also a tool of rhetoric. And we often hear this, even to very recently, Pakistan warning of a nuclear response to India, to Indian threats, underscores a degree which rivers have been entangled with nationalism and security. So, in this sense, the book is not just about the treaty, it's also about the theater of India Pakistan politics itself. And I think I've employed this with a particular style of writing. It moves away from the usual pattern like we researchers do. So I've used a lot of archival material, letters, diaries, memoirs, official papers, many of which are little known or even forgotten, I think. So, and I combine these material with an engaging, almost narrative-driven style. So, sort of catches the author, catches the reader. It's a kind of a story that feels alive. So, it's a style that is useful when you bringing in history, where you're bringing in a lot of archival material. And lastly, I think the book also, and very early on in the very beginning of it, in the preface itself, I do bring the issue of continuity and contrast, uh, uh, the Indus Basin, the Indus Water Treaty, and also the style of leadership, the style of political leadership. And I think that's a compelling read in the book. And I place two very different styles of leadership side by side. Nehru, who signed the treaty, he embodied moral idealism, treating the treaty as a bold gesture of cooperation and faith in regional partnership. Modi The current Prime Minister, by contrast, brings a hard-edged strategic pragmatism, viewing the treaty less as a symbol of goodwill and more as a tool of leverage in an age defined by provocation and mistrust. So I think this difference is quite striking, and one can get a good sense of this as one reads the book. And this comparison allows the book to reflect on a broader transformation in India's strategic culture from the post-colonial idealism of the 1960s to the more security-driven calculus of an aspiring global power as we see India today. And for readers, this not only um, illuminates the Indus Basin issue, but also offers a window into India's evolving global posture.
Okay, so that's really a fascinating, look at the motivations behind your work and how it builds on your previous research and and the book also. So, and it also clears that water politics is as dynamic as ever. And now coming to the the point you also mentioned about the climate change, and these environmental changes are also adding to these of the challenges between both the countries. And we have seen that the climate change or the glacier retreat and the shifting rainfall pattern are also reshaping the water availability across the South Asia. So how do you see these environmental factors complicate the operational as well as the legal framework of this Indus Water Treaty?
Yeah, I mean, this is a fair question to ask because we are in a time when we are clearly seeing, climate change leaving its impact on the glaciers, and the glaciers are changing. We've seen how the monsoon pattern has turned around considerably. Precipitation levels are in a flux. So, and all these impact the basin because these are what can be described as your natural source of water. And so, if you look at the Himalaya belt from the west to the east, you find that more on the western side, the river basins are more glacier fed. So glacier becomes an important part of the Indus Basin as you move east. As we move towards the Brahmaputra on the eastern side, we find that the glacial snow and ice contribution to the flow is far less than the precipitation. So obviously for the Indus Basin, the glaciers are important, and the glaciers are being impacted by global warming, and that link is very clear. These were not very much in the play when it was being negotiated in the 1950s. It was more about what is called, uh, you know, more water from the basin. The engineers looked at the basin as optimal development of the basin and its water content for development. So I think we've gone through that period now. Water and development, water and projects are now a thing of the past. Now we have to evaluate the basin through the new science, the climate science that is emerging in terms of the flow patterns, in terms of the flood season now as the glacial melt. We have to also now have a long-term perspective of the basin, keeping in mind global warming and the climate change impact. We have to reassess the basin demography in the sense of uh, the people who are directly related and dependent on the water resources of the Indus Basin. That number has phenomenally increased from when the treaty was signed in 1960. So, the engineering oriented and the engineering focused period of time has to now move towards bringing in more attention to science in our relationship in this basin, and also looking at more water management approaches. And that is now the real issue: how to manage the rivers and the waters of the rivers. So that management is quite important. We need to determine the new elements of the basin And that is why I think if you move beyond the India-Pakistan relationship and move beyond the treaty, I think these elements would be required to be discussed between the two countries when politically it is right. And I hope that Pakistan realizes this because, as I said, the water of the Indus Basin is very existential for Pakistan, and they need to come up front in having a dialogue with India because the reality is that India is the upper riparian state. The reality is that India has put the treaty in abeyance. Of course, abeyance does not mean that it has abrogated the treaty. It has left some scope for discussion. But I think Pakistan needs to mend its way. It's very important. The past can no longer be played now with Pakistan, with India, and they need to come up front and discuss various issues. So I think these are changes that we'll have to see. These are changes that is important, and these changes have to be taken into account when you look at the basin. And how the treaty will evolve will be precisely based on this new knowledge, this new finding, and the new changes that are happening in the Indus basin.
So, given your expertise in strategic affairs, so how do you see water security intersecting with national security in the South Asian context overall?
Well, in South Asia, water security and national security are deeply intertwined. And we all understand the reason behind it because these are existential resources. And given our demography and given our agricultural sector, water is vital, and therefore, water security and national security get intertwined. I think we also know that the region is the most densely populated. It is, as I said, climate stressed. And politically, at least the neighborhood of India seems very fragile. Right? So, and if you look at the rivers, the major rivers in South Asia, the Indus, the Ganga, the Brahmaputra, they all cross borders. And that makes water not just a resource, but a strategic asset and potentially a source of friction. So, on one level, water is about survival, drinking water, irrigation, energy, and without it, no economy can grow, no society can remain stable. At another level, in a region with unsettled boundaries and long histories of conflict, rivers easily become symbols of sovereignty and instruments of power. And that is why disputes over dams or diversions or projects that one is making can quickly spill into larger security tensions. But water is also a paradox, and that is quite clearly seen in the South Asian context. It divides, but it can also connect. Right? Shared rivers have the potential to force cooperation, to keep channels of dialogue open, even when politics breaks down. The Indus Water Treaty is a good example, and it worked. Till, of course, now it has been put in abeyance. It shows that even adversaries can cooperate when faced with shared vulnerabilities. So, when you look ahead and when you see this region, climate change certainly makes this intersection even sharper. All these changes that are happening, the melting of the glaciers, the erratic monsoons, the intensifying floods and droughts, they will test the fragile states and the fragile agreements. We have several agreements in South Asia. Indus waters on the western side, we have several treaties with Nepal, and the Ganga Treaty, which is up for revision if the two parties so want it next year. And we have also what is called Memorandum of Understanding on several projects with Bhutan. So, we can see all this, the hydrological changes that are happening in the region clearly affecting the agreements and the treaties that have existed for several decades. So if you politically manage it poorly, this could deepen insecurity. And if it is politically managed wisely, it could become the basis for new regional cooperation, as I said, with new data, with new knowledge, with new facts. Right? And I think that is something very important. So in South Asia, finally, I would say that water is no longer just a development issue or just an environmental issue. It is a strategic issue, one that could either sharpen old conflicts, old troubles, old hurts, or with political foresight, uh, become a bridge to a more a more cooperative future. So the choice ultimately lies with the political will of the states that share these rivers.
So that's really a powerful reminder of how water is not just a resource but a strategic asset with far-reaching implication. So, Dr. Sinha, what a compelling discussion, and thank you so much for your insights into the Indus Water Treaty, its challenges, its intersections with the geopolitics and the climate change, and you have given us a lot to reflect on. Thank you so much once again, and thank you so much for to our listeners. We hope this episode has also deepened your understanding of the intricate ties between water and the power in South Asia. So do join us for our next thought-provoking discussion and conversation that force and shapes our region's future. Thank you so much.